Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome to the Resilience Resourcing Podcast. This is a connection space where badass women share their real on their way to resilience. Each week, I have the pleasure of spotlighting women dominating in a diverse landscape of fields, ranging from performance neurotraining to film and all in between. You will get to know the unique qualities these women each carry and how connecting with these empowering women's stories bring about camaraderie and in turn empower you towards your unique dreams and goals. It seems like there has been so many extremes. I was just talking to my family about this last weekend. It was like, we have to just stop believing this. Like, the media is wanting that. Like, that's literally how they make money, is getting you super like into this so that you will fight with everybody and so that you will watch their show more. Like, doesn't matter if you're watching Fox or CNN, extremes of both sides. I right out of college, I was like, I came such a conservative side to such a liberal side because I was just like, I cannot believe this, and you go completely the other way. I've balanced out because I feel like it doesn't work to be on either extreme if you're not willing to come together and talk like your grandma you were talking about, like community. We need people. We need to be able to have discussions and disagreements and find our way again. But like, I am also a big fan of like Brene Brown and people who talk about the holistic psychologist, people who talk about the actual boundaries and like what you do and don't have to accept. Even if you can still love a person, you can still disagree with them and find a way, to work through that. Generations of dysfunction, aren't going to change overnight. And it doesn't matter who it is, it's not going to change overnight. But I think the thing that makes me sad and mad in some ways is the fact that, like the whole Black Lives Matter thing, that happened right when I graduated college. It was like kind of happening as I was going to college. And I took a long time to go back to college because I didn't want to go straight out of high school. I went to community college and I took like 7 years before I went back and got my degree. But it was since that was what everybody was talking about. The height was the Black Lives Matter, the movement that was happening at that time. And my biggest thing was like, white people we have caused so much harm that we just need to shut up and let people have feelings, emotions, outrage, whatever it is, even if you don't agree with them blowing up buildings or whatever. How long did they have to endure slavery and all this other that was completely wrong? Like,
get to that point,
just shut up and like stop saying anything, even if you like. That was my biggest thing. I was like, and I had family that was just so like, I can't believe that this is people are doing this, and I'm like, really? Like, you didn't understand that slavery happened and has still been happening, and there's been racism just back. Like, now we're finally seeing some of it. People are seeing it that weren't in the middle of areas that it was as prevalent maybe, and they're actually realizing it now. But I'm like, you have to just give space for people to have emotion and feelings and like outrage. Could you imagine like and that
about empathy? Like, I think that's where it comes, and I think that's hard. Like, you mentioned Brene Brown, and I always think of empathy when I think of her. One of the hardest things we can do is step into someone else's shoes. And if you want to describe social work in a sentence, it's like, the act of jumping into someone else's shoes to help encourage them to move forward. Because there's just so much that people go through that we have no idea. So it's so easy to judge what we're seeing from, one single act versus looking at like, okay, what's the whole historic, thing that they've gone through that has led to that point.
exactly.
Because if we can see that, we we might have a little bit more understanding, and we also might have a little bit more understanding even like what are they fighting for, because I think in a lot of these movements that are happening, we are definitely in a time period where there's so many powerful movements, and people aren't seeing the reason why there is that. Like, we get distracted by all of these things that are happening, like Black Lives Matter, it was, it all became about riots, and it was like, okay, but why are the riots occurring? What led to this moment? And it doesn't say that riots are okay or not okay. That's a whole nother piece for people to think about. But I would love for people to think like, what has led to the moment that people in our country feel that angry?
Exactly.
That is angry. And and this I can even throw it on the flip side. Like I was, if you want to go to the Capitol riot, that's a huge thing that's talking about. And that is hard because that's a whole different group, right? We're talking about a whole different side. But I always have to take a pause and be like, okay, what led to this moment? Like I have feelings. We all have feelings about both of these movements that are going on or these acts. But what is leading to our society that we have people this angry?
Exactly. And it's like what's that quote of don't go downstream and keep taking them out of the river, go upstream and understand why the frick they're falling in the river in the first place. And that is the whole like thing, is that people just want to be like, well, this act right now I don't agree with. I don't care about the giant like
system that put them into this
exactly spot. And there's so much like I have to be careful because I use this term and sometimes it frustrates people because to me, I'm the first person in my entire family to get my bachelor's degree. And I'm the youngest. I had a traumatic brain injury. I should not be able to have gotten to this place. And for me, it was a goal of mine. I just wanted my bachelor's degree. I can't even tell you why. I've always just wanted education. And that means a lot to me. My education, what I've learned in school, I always want to learn. I want to go back. I want to get my master's. I'd love to go to get my doctorate because I love learning, not because it gives me some status or anything like that. Like I can think of the happiest time in my life recently, and it was in school. Like I just love it. I love learning. And but I see that a lot of there's just when people don't have a space to have an objective point of view, to learn both sides, to kind of open up to those things, they are easily just led to believe whatever their perspective or whatever meets their bias, and so that has been a frustration when talking to certain people, because it's like, oh, like there just isn't that, like, either nothing has sparked that desire to learn more of the situation and why this is happening. It's more based off of, well, we've learned, like I hear this all the time, we've learned from history that history repeats itself, and if people start doing this and this is going to happen. And it's like, okay, but you have to understand why it is happening. And so people, a lot of people in my life who are still very conservative and just anti a lot of things that have been happening lately, there's this just turn off of not wanting to learn about the other person's experience, and then, like you said, an empathetic way of like, but why do you think that's happening? And like, even if you think you weren't part of that, which unfortunately you probably were, even if you think you weren't part of that, like, can you kind of put yourself in their shoes and recognize that, like, that, what if that happened to you? How would you feel?
And I think it's like, what's interesting and the challenge is like, do they not want to learn, or is it scary to learn? Like because it's very vulnerable, when we really think about it, and having to challenge ourselves to see the world differently is scary. There's a lot of unknowns. There's just a lot of things that you might have to personally have to sit with a little bit differently. And I don't think everyone's ready for that. I think that we're asking people to really put themselves in a very vulnerable state. And I think we're like pushing it, come on, to see this, why? Like, I want you to ask these questions. We also have to realize we're asking them to do something that is really scary. And I think it's important to just kind of remember that, because I always think of that like in social work when I'm asking families, you know, to make a change, be like, hey, you might need to try this to get your kid to come to school, or like, hey, maybe we need to like relook at this, like maybe you guys need to move across town. I'm asking them to think about really scary things. I'm asking them to change their whole life in a small matter or a big matter. And these families might not be ready. They might be in their comfort zone, and that might just be where they feel safe.
Yeah.
Because I think safety is for everyone, no matter who you are, is the most primal thing we want, right? Like that's survival right there. We're going to do everything we can to keep ourselves safe, and that's physically and emotionally. And that's where I think we find a lot of that resistance is they might not feel safe asking those questions yet. And what spaces do they need to be in to feel safe?
See, this blows my mind. This has happened so many times on my podcast where I recognize people who have been the most resilient, who have gone through their own hurts and could justifiably have a lot of negative feelings towards certain people, take on an attitude of grace and understanding for another side that has been hurtful or has actually caused harm. And I get humbled time and time again hearing from people like you, because I think my personality has always been a protective and like kind of like a fighter. That's my personality, and I am like, wait, what did you say? What did you do? How dare you? Like, whatever, But the people who make change and who are so resilient are people like you who can actually put yourself in the shoes of the person causing harm. Like, that is hard to do. And I think what you're even saying is we're asking other people to do that, but are we doing that for them? Like, I think that's the biggest part of the social worker is actually leading by example and doing those hard things as an example. And that's what leads other people to follow in those footsteps and be someone who can, okay, you're like, the psychology way of understanding it is projecting your pain on me. I'm not going to take that personally. I recognize that you're in a hard place and this is why you're doing it, even though it could be painful and it's hurtful, and we don't want that to continue. Like, finding that line of like allowing for people to grow, I think that that's a very hard thing to do. Like, I'm just impressed.
And there's good days and there's bad days. You caught me on a good day. I got on great to me, I guess, today. I don't know. Maybe it's Saturday, but I think we all struggle. It sounds so much easier on a podcast, when we're talking about it. And I'm sure there are moments where I am fully tested and in a fully different mindset. And those are moments where I'm like, okay, I got to back up. I need to clear my head here. I need to take a second. Because there are many moments of frustration that happen, but I guess we get so tired that we want change that I'm finally like at this point where I'm like, well, we got to take a different tactic. Yeah, we want change. Like the I don't know, maybe the fight in me, I'm like, well, you know what, maybe me fighting is to finally find grace. I gotta try something different.
Yeah,
I'm ready for a win.
finding the way to win that isn't always the most confrontational. Sometimes I work for a law firm.
Oh, okay.
I actually noticed the tactic of the attorneys that I work with is often not to go towards litigation and actually like, fighting it out, because justice. And I thought, oh, I would love working for a law firm because I'm all about justice. Like, I've literally had people tell me that before. But is that the way to actually bring about healthy, good change that actually works and works for both sides? Oftentimes it's coming to the table and trying to come up with an agreement prior to paying tons of money to fight it out in court and have a judge decide for you. And it's like, I I'm sure there are definitely spaces where that's needed for justice sake. As we've seen in, what happened with, I'm totally blank. My brain. I blank on the names of these people, but the man who was killed recently, that was all over the news because the cop was on his neck, and I can't even, like,
George Floyd?
So traumatic. Yes. And some of the justice that we saw with the police officer that got finally put up and all of that, like, there are definitely times where you have to full on, like, no more, like, this is not okay. But I feel like overall, if we can move towards a way to come together and have disagreements but find some way to move forward, that in the long run it is going to bring about change probably faster than just constantly trying to one person kind of thing.
And it's hard because I'm sure there's going to be listeners to this who are going to say, well, that justice isn't enough justice. And I won't disagree with them on that. I think there's a lot of these circumstances where it does feel like a compromise a lot of these times. And that's where, like, you start to have that internal battle of, like, what does justice even mean at this point? Yeah. Like, I don't have an answer to that, that's for sure. But I think we have so many people who are just tired. I think at the end of the day, like, when I look at all of this, it's like they're tired for just, I'm sorry if you hear my son back there. The life of having an 18-month-old.
Oh yeah.
But they're exhausted, they're tired of compromises, they're tired of just not enough. And I think I always question myself, like, when would it ever be enough? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. I feel you when you said that, like, but it is a compromise, and I think that deep down, like, that's what I get just all riled up about, because I'm like, why do we need to allow compromise when things are wrong, when things we know are wrong? Like, there's no question of whether this isn't like maybe it's right. No, racism, straight up wrong. What we did and have continued to do to Black people of color is wrong. The way that we took this land from Native Americans and displaced them, and now we act like we own it and give them whatever, like, that is so wrong. Like, there's no question about that. But like you said, you get to a place where you're fatigued, like, you mentally can only handle so much. And it's like, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, if we can just get enough, like, people to just stand up and, like, straight up, people in leadership, people in places where
there's certain people we need.
Yeah. And it's by having Black people in those areas, literally having them literally as the change, because they are the change. They are what we've needed all along. And instead we've tried to control. Instead we've tried to, well, maybe we can, instead of, like, give up the control, the power, like, it isn't ours in the first place. So, wow, thank you for just having this conversation. I'm sure it's not easy. I never want you to feel like, on the spot at all. And I am really, really humbled by the grace that you have, because the ways that you word things, I'm like, like, I don't know if I could have that much grace. So, I'm very humbled by that. What?
I said, no, I'm just thankful that you're talking to me. Like, this was, like, it's been refreshing. And I don't think we have enough moments where we get to just talk, like, and this is just, like, worldwide, but, like, where it doesn't come from just, like, okay, I want to hammer this point. Like, I'm getting in this conversation because I want to make sure that Holly walks away knowing I want to fight for these XYZ. It's like, no, we're just, like, let's just talk about it because we're growing from it. I mean, you got my mind just spinning, of all these topics, and just being like, oh, I haven't even thought about that, or, like, that hasn't come in my mind lately. And that's what I want to welcome more into my life. Like, I look at this next year, and I hope other people can do this. It's just, like, challenging ourselves to have conversations, being willing to grow a little bit.
I think that's the hardest thing. Honestly, that's why I try to do my podcast very casual, because everybody you knew this. I didn't plan any of this conversation. There was no like, I'm going to talk about XYZ. Like, I don't do that. I have never done that on my podcast because I want it to be natural. But in that means that some conversations you're like, crap, did I say something, whatever? And I think that that's what we need to find a way to get away from the fear of just having a conversation. Because I think that's how you move forward. That's how you hear of what's going on. How are people feeling? How is it feeling every day to be in the South? I don't know, because I've never lived in the South, but I know, you know, you had a totally different experience growing up in the same town that I did, because you were Black, and I would never have known that because I didn't have that experience. And thank you for being vulnerable to share that, because like I feel like it's not always easy to just open up and be like, no, like I didn't feel, you know, I had a good experience, but I also didn't see people like me in certain areas. And like I love that you have your master's in social work and that you're making so much change, and that it's just people like you super inspire me that there is good in this world and that there is change that is slowly happening. And that
and we have to be reminded of that constantly. Like people ask me all the time, like, why are you not burnt out in social work? Like that seems like I would just burn out in a heartbeat. And I sit there and reminded, like, and I said this earlier in the podcast, like really you should be sitting here are my families, you know, the kids that I work with, because they are seriously the most resilient people I know. And no matter what social work job I've ever done, I always come back to these families, and these kids are what just moved me, because even when I'm working on them of like, why is your kid not at school? And then all of a sudden I'm just like, wow, this person is just incredible. You know, they're frustrating me so much right now, but at the end of the day, it's a single mom who's getting 5 kids to school, who's trying to provide food for them, you know, and I sit there and you have to like take that pause. Because I think we're always asking something from someone. We always want something from people. First, just like realizing like what they already have, or like what they already have on their plate.
And what they're teaching you, and just who they are, the fact that they're showing up day in and day out in the situation that they're in, that it's, you know, you couldn't even imagine being in that situation. And how like those people teach us, they teach us like, wow, like, you know, nothing is impossible. I said that at the end of last year with this podcast. I saw things that I was like, are you kidding me? Like for people to overcome things that I talked to Virginia Burton. I don't know if you saw her on the news. She was on King 5, so here, but she was also nationwide. The Today Show had like a thing about her and everything. She overcame drug addiction after 40 years on the streets, and extreme trauma, abuse, all kinds of things, many prison sentences. And she's like nationwide speaker now for Overcomers Network, which is incredible. And it's people like that that have had such a difficult hand dealt them, that they didn't like do anything to cause those things to happen. We all have things that we could take responsibility for, but like ultimately they were born into, you know, either it's not wealth, not privilege, racism, whatever it is. There's a number of things that people are born into, and they still show up day in and day out. And like you had said, with what you're figuring out as during this pandemic and how you guys are figuring out to move forward, you don't have this like, this is how you move forward, this is, you do XYZ. It's like, no, I take one step from the other. Yeah. And so I think there's so much.
Next year will probably be totally different.
What was that?
I said next year will probably be totally different. Whatever we figure out for this year will probably be totally different for next year. Like we're humans. Like this is life. Like I think life is always going to throw us a bajillion of curveballs. I will say the last few years have been definitely a bigger curveball than I think many of us were ready for. But at the end of the day, like we have so many ups and downs, you know, through our lifetime. I hope, you know, I'm going to live a long time, and I know there's going to be really positive moments and there's going to be really negative, but they're all going to shape who I am. You know, the positive, the good and the bad. Is kind of what shapes us. And like, I think we have to honor no matter what that is. You know, not all of us are going to have like these crazy stories where we've had all of this trauma or all of these things go on with us. But even if you don't have that, your story is important. That's what I always try to, because I get told that actually, I think more often I'm like, it's just whatever. And I'm like, but it's not whatever to you, you know? And I'm like, so that's important. Like
That's
that's
really
important.
good. I love how you said that. Because I think the media does it highlights people who've had the worst or the best, the high success or, you know, overcoming. And those are really inspiring stories, but it's also the people who just show up every day, who just recognize I overcame yesterday and this was difficult. And look, I'm here again today. And, you know, I think that's a true testament to what resilience really is. It's not this like overnight success or like this big, you know, you can see this like story that was like horrible and then it's way better. Like it, and if you talk to people who have those stories, what you hear is the daily what's actually happening. And I think I think you've been so good to explain that in the matter of like, we don't even know what we're doing. We're just showing up. Like we're just learning and we're human. And I feel like these are the things that people need to hear, because we need to stop expecting people to have this overnight success story or putting this like thing up here where like we have, especially because of social media, we have these things that people think like everybody's just so, you know, better than me. They've got it all figured out. Yeah, and nobody does. It doesn't matter where you're at, who you are, nobody has it figured out. And the more we all admit that we're on the journey, we can have conversations that are difficult and we can grow, and there's not as much pressure or judgment for where you are. I think that often that is probably part of the reason why people don't have the discussions, is because they don't want to be judged for where they're at. And I think that bring it on. Like if judgment means, I don't think judgment needs to have a place anyways, but for me in school, I had to bring it on. Like I had to be like, you know what? I have I'm a white person of privilege, and I'm coming into this situation feeling very awkward because I'm like, oh no, like everybody's going to be like pissed at me just because of where I stand in society. And I had to just shut up and listen and just realize my place in society, but also not be afraid to explain my experience too. And I think that was very difficult to do. In my diversity class, I brought that up and it was very difficult. And the professor really handled it well. And she said, you know, either way, the way that we listen to somebody's perspective, it is important because it informs how they understand the world. And the way that you said that, like listening to people, even if you totally disagree with them, like it allows you to have empathy. And I think that we've just shut people off that we disagree with and we don't want to hear and understand. And maybe the fact that simply listening to that person who's projecting and treating you horribly, even though ultimately, like in a justice form, you shouldn't have to, if we do, it allows them to be heard and to not feel like they're not heard. And I think that Brene Brown talks about that all the time. People just want to be heard. Like
they do, and that's from anyone. Anyone wants to be heard. And I think, you know, you had mentioned it, and I do think, you know, obviously boundaries, like what you're going to accept in is huge in all of this. Like you should not, I'm definitely not telling people to go and be treated awful. You know, like I don't want people to go sit down like, well, I know I disagree with this, so give it to me. Because I do think we should still have respect for each other, and that we should have our boundaries and protect ourselves. You know, like these conversations would not be easy, and I think there's ways to set up meaningful conversations, even if they're difficult, versus being like, I'm going to take it all in. Because I think that's kind of what's happened a lot of the times. It's definitely the most vulnerable have been sitting down and listening, and at the end of the day, they're getting shamed and they're getting put down and they're having to get it dished out to them. That's like the simple word to say it, you know? And they don't deserve that. And I think that's where it's like, no, let's have these meaningful conversations in a respectful way. that is truly possible.
Yeah.
And you can still voice your opinion throughout it.
I've learned so much from you. I feel like I want you to teach me more about social work because you're just so wise. Like you have so much wisdom that I've learned more than I knew I would in this podcast, just because like I had this preconceived idea of what I knew social work to be, more in a medical side of things and less in the like, actually being out in schools and dynamics where kids don't have certain resources and your own experience of growing up in an area where there wasn't a ton of diversity and what that meant to you and how you didn't have a horrible experience, but there were certain areas that you look back on and you're like, well, that was wrong. Well, that I wouldn't want my kid to go through that. And I just thank you so much. Like I can imagine that this would be kind of random and just a little bit odd. But I do it out of my car. Sometimes I do it in a studio. I do it wherever I want. I don't really
I watched some of your old ones. I was like, what am I getting myself into? I was like, let me make sure I can watch her podcast before I know what I'm signing up for. And I was like, oh, she's in her car. I noticed that one of them.
There's not a ton of I don't know. I think most people either listen to this or they watch it, but a lot of people listen to it while they're like going to work or something like that. So I don't worry a ton about the background. I also don't want to be super obsessed about that kind of stuff because I really just want to connect with people. And that's what I've tried to do. And every podcast that I do is, hear their story. That's the whole point, is I get to have this platform to hear your story and for you to share that with whoever's listening, to see like what resilience looks like in your space. And sometimes it is you're a conduit of that resilience, and it might be something that you're doing as you're, like you said, in your career. The people you work with is where you see so much resilience because of what they're dealing with. And that is giving a voice to them, in my opinion, because you're actually telling people like, hey, there's people out there that are going through this situation that people might not know. And I have totally different types of people that listen to this podcast, and I hope that it continues that way, where it's not just a certain type of stereotype that listens to this podcast, because I hope that people's minds are expanded. Like that's the whole goal. And that people just feel connected more and more, because I think it's high school. We haven't talked we barely connected in high school.
I was like barely even in that time.
Yeah.
So,
but look at something so simple as a podcast could bring about connection to learn more and expand and grow. And to me, that's like the amazing part of podcasts, is it just gives you an opportunity.
I think that's so cool. I told Nick, I was like, I need to learn from her. I want to learn how to make a podcast. This is so cool.
I had another friend do the same thing. One of my other friends I've known forever. She's like, how do you do this? I'm like, honestly, I don't know. And there's not a whole lot to it. It's just finding people that you're like, I want to hear their story because they're an amazing person. So I think you're amazing. That's why I reached out to you. And I'm so thankful that you felt comfortable coming on here and sharing your story and sharing what you do, because we need people like you out there who don't give up, speaking into people's lives, being a resource to people, educating, having empathy. I think you have a ton of empathy and you remind me of Brene Brown. So yeah,
I'm gonna throw it right back at you because I can tell you're about to wrap up on me, but I know I appreciate you even having this platform, asking people from all different walks of life to be on the podcast. I definitely did my research. I was through and I was just like, it's incredible how you're making a platform that it's not just about the most famous. It's what we always hear about, if there's stories, then you're finding, I'm gonna call myself average folk, just to talk to and hear to. And I think that's such a powerful platform that we need more of. I think we all need to hear from each other and hear, because even listening to the few I did was like, oh, I kind of relate to that. Oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And it was like, these are other people who are just like us. So I know you're gonna continue having people listen to your podcast, because I think what the world is craving connection. I think we are craving it right now, and we're doing anything we can just to find other people that we can relate to. And thank you for making a platform that people can get that from.
that means a ton, more than I can explain, because I didn't ever think I honestly didn't have anything like set up of the specific types of people or anything. It was like, I have seen so many amazing people out there that need to have a voice, and I want to give that connection space. And to think that that people even trust me to do this is just like mind blowing. But really, I think you're correct. It's connection. People need connection. People want to know from everyone, average, everyday people to the person who's, making it big. It doesn't matter where you're at. And that's what I saw when I did a retreat in 2019 that was to help resource an area with mental health resources that just didn't have a lot of those. But my whole goal was to get away from the stigma and really create. That's what resilience resourcing was. That's what started resilience resourcing, was that retreat. And I had a social worker who came and offered different types of modalities to help people heal, and all types of, people speaking, music, art therapy. I had all kinds of different things, but I wanted it to be like a spa, something that where people didn't think that they just had to come and feel bad, but that they could come and just connect with people no matter who they were. And the success of that to me was the fact that I had people who work with the highest of the high, I mean, like Olympic athletes, to people who just came off the street and wanted a meal. And there wasn't this status thing. Every single person talked and connected. And that is my dream for resilience resourcing, is that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. I want to hear, and I want to connect, and I want people to feel connected, because that is what we need in life. We need connection, and connection breeds resources. It breeds the ability to find resources. And that ultimately is what everybody needs in the first place. So why not just create that? So
snaps to you. I'm excited. That makes me pumped.
Resilience Resourcing was created to be a platform from which to share resources for resilience with those who may not otherwise have access to them. The first step in resourcing is connection. Through connection, we gain knowledge and access to empowering resources. This is the hope with each podcast I share, to bring you closer to empowering resources that will transform the way you think and feel about yourself, and raise funds to share resources with those who may not be able to afford them. Stay tuned for next episodes on www.resilienceresourcing.com.